The moment Lady Seraphina Ashcombe stepped into the winter-lit hall, conversation did not cease so much as fracture, voices thinning into cautious murmurs as eyes turned and then slid away again, as though attention itself might provoke disaster. She felt it instantly, the familiar tightening of air around her, the subtle retreat of bodies that knew better than to draw close. No suitor had dared approach her in years, not because she lacked beauty or wit, but because her name carried something heavier than scandal, something that clung and warned and ruined without ever fully explaining itself. She moved with practiced composure, gloved hands steady, expression serene, as though the silence trailing her were an honor rather than exile. This was how survival looked now: calm, controlled, untouchable. She had learned, long ago, that curiosity could be crueler than contempt. The whispers followed regardless, shaping her into a story no one wished to finish telling. Some said tragedy lingered where she walked, others claimed misfortune favored her proximity, and though none could say precisely what she had done, certainty was never required when fear proved more convenient. Seraphina accepted her isolation without protest, because protest required hope, and hope had been stripped from her in a season she no longer measured by dates. Endurance had become her inheritance, passed quietly from one dismissed invitation to the next. Tonight was no different, or so she believed. Across the room, the Duke of Ravensmere watched her with an attention that did not waver. Alaric Thornwick was not a man given to impulsive judgment, nor did he mistake rumor for truth. He had heard the warnings, every one of them, delivered in lowered voices and urgent glances, each insistence sharpened by the same conclusion: avoid her. Yet what held him was not defiance, but the precision of her restraint, the way she stood as though she had already weathered judgment and found it lacking. Where others saw danger, he saw deliberateness; where others recoiled, he observed choice. Seraphina sensed him before she looked, the prickle of awareness tracing down her spine, sharpened by the fact that he did not withdraw when her gaze finally lifted. Their eyes met, and for the briefest moment, something shifted. Not recognition, not attraction, but an unmistakable awareness of being seen without assumption. The weight of it unsettled her far more than open hostility ever had. He did not smile, he did not look away. He simply held her attention, as though deciding something irreversible. Around them, the hall resumed its careful rhythm, unaware that a boundary had just been breached. Seraphina inclined her head slightly, a reflex born of habit rather than invitation, and turned away, dismissing the moment as anomaly. She could not know that, in choosing not to heed the warnings whispered all around him, the Duke had already altered the course of both their lives. The story they told about Lady Seraphina Ashcombe never began at the beginning, because beginnings required accuracy, and accuracy had never served those who preferred blame. What lingered instead was a shape of memory passed from voice to voice, each retelling smoothing inconvenient edges until only implication remained. Years earlier, when Seraphina had still been young enough to believe that truth would protect her, a tragedy had unfolded within a household not her own, swift and devastating, leaving grief, unanswered questions, and a silence that settled too neatly to be innocent. She had been present, nothing more, but presence proved sufficient when influence demanded distance from consequence. Someone else's error, someone else's neglect, had found its way onto her name because her family lacked the power to resist the convenience of her sacrifice. No accusation had ever been spoken aloud, yet judgment had embedded itself so thoroughly that denial became pointless. The absence of clarity allowed imagination to thrive, and imagination was always crueler than fact. Seraphina learned quickly what that cruelty required of her. She learned that explanations invited scrutiny, that grief expressed openly invited suspicion, and that indignation only sharpened interest. So she learned restraint instead, folding herself inward, until composure replaced innocence, and silence replaced defense. She did not protest when invitations dwindled, nor when glances turned cautious and laughter quieted at her approach. Each withdrawal taught her the same lesson, that survival did not depend on correction but endurance. Over time, she cultivated a stillness that others mistook for coldness, unaware that it was discipline holding something far more volatile beneath its surface. She mourned in private, not only the tragedy itself, but the self she had been before endurance became necessary. There were nights when memory pressed harder, when she recalled the precise moment she realized no one intended to ask what truly happened. The realization had not arrived as shock but resignation, a quiet understanding that the narrative had already been chosen. She had been useful as distance, as warning, as containment. Even those who suspected injustice found it easier to look away than to intervene. That knowledge carved itself deep, shaping her into someone who trusted neither vindication nor kindness. Trust required belief in permanence, and permanence had abandoned her long ago. Yet beneath the careful control, Seraphina remained observant, intelligent, and acutely aware of the world's mechanisms. She understood power because she had watched it operate against her, subtle and efficient. She understood fear because she had lived within its shadow. What she did not allow herself was longing, because longing suggested the possibility of something more, and hope, once lost, was dangerous to reclaim. It was easier to exist as she was, self-contained and untouchable, than to risk discovery of how deeply the old wounds still shaped her. By the time society decided who she was, Seraphina had already learned how to survive being misjudged. What she had not learned, and what she did not yet suspect she would need to learn, was how to survive being seen. Duke Alaric Thornwick had long ago learned that power announced itself most loudly through restraint. Ravensmere did not require spectacle to command respect, nor did its duke indulge the expectations that followed his title. He moved through influence as one might through a well-mapped estate, aware of every boundary, every weakness, every quiet leverage point that others overlooked. His authority was not inherited carelessly, but maintained through consistency, through a reputation for decisions that did not bend under pressure or sentiment. Those who advised him trusted that he listened. Those who opposed him understood that once he chose a course, persuasion would no longer apply. It was precisely because of this reputation that the warnings reached him so quickly after the winter gathering. They came from allies, from distant relatives, from voices that framed concern as loyalty, each repeating the same instruction with varying degrees of urgency. Lady Seraphina Ashcombe was to be avoided. Association with her invited complication. Proximity would stain judgment. Some spoke of danger without defining it, others of misfortune that followed her presence, all of them confident that explanation was unnecessary. Alaric listened to each warning without interruption, noting not only what was said, but what was conspicuously absent. No one offered evidence. No one claimed direct knowledge. Fear, it seemed, had become self-sustaining. Alaric had never trusted narratives that thrived on vagueness. Too often, he had seen reputations shaped to serve convenience rather than truth, particularly when responsibility threatened those accustomed to immunity. The more insistently Seraphina was framed as a liability, the more he recognized a familiar pattern, one that relied on silence and repetition to replace fact. He did not yet feel affection, nor did he romanticize injustice, but something within him resisted the ease with which a woman could be reduced to warning rather than person. His interest was measured, intellectual at first, rooted in principle rather than desire. He thought again of the moment their eyes had met across the hall, of the absence of appeal or defensiveness in her gaze. She had not sought his attention, nor recoiled from it. There had been no calculation there, only a composure too deliberate to be false. Alaric understood composure intimately. He recognized it as the mark of someone who had learned to survive observation. That recognition unsettled him more than the rumors ever could. In the days that followed, he did not seek her out, nor did he announce curiosity. Instead, he began to listen differently, asking questions that appeared incidental, requesting records under unrelated pretenses, tracing the faint outlines of a story that no one seemed eager to finish. What emerged was not clarity but contradiction, gaps where certainty should have lived, and an unmistakable sense that blame had traveled an unusually efficient path. Alaric did not draw conclusions prematurely. He never did. But his attention sharpened, guided by a quiet conviction that truth, when avoided so carefully, was often being protected from discovery. By the time he next encountered Seraphina, his resolve had already shifted. He would not approach her as curiosity, nor as charity. He would approach her as he approached any matter that demanded integrity, without fear of consequence and without reliance on assumption. The warnings had done their work, but not as intended. They had not repelled him. They had made retreat impossible. The next occasion on which Lady Seraphina Ashcombe found herself in Duke Alaric Thornwick's presence was one she could neither avoid nor easily dismiss, a formal gathering arranged under the guise of obligation rather than celebration, where attendance was expected and absence noted. She entered with the same measured calm she had perfected over years of scrutiny, aware that her presence would again produce distance, that subtle rearrangement of space that signaled collective discomfort. What she did not anticipate was the deliberate absence of that distance in one particular quarter of the room. Alaric did not stand apart, nor did he linger at the margins as courtesy demanded of those who wished to avoid notice. Instead, he positioned himself where approach required intention, where retreat would be conspicuous. When Seraphina realized this, irritation flickered briefly beneath her composure, sharpened by the certainty that whatever this was, it was not accidental. He addressed her without preamble, his tone neither deferential nor familiar, as though speaking to her were the most natural choice in the room. There was no apology for intrusion, no acknowledgement of the rumors that clung to her name, and no performative civility meant to reassure onlookers. He spoke of the event itself, of a matter requiring observation rather than opinion, inviting her perspective without framing it as favor. The simplicity of it unsettled her. Seraphina responded with controlled precision, meeting him word for word, careful not to reveal surprise or resentment. She expected provocation, perhaps even mockery, yet found neither. His attention did not waver, nor did it probe. It rested on her with an evenness that suggested assessment rather than judgment. Around them, the atmosphere shifted almost imperceptibly, curiosity tightening where indifference had once reigned. Seraphina felt the weight of it immediately, the unspoken question of why he remained so close, why he did not retreat as others always did. She gave him nothing beyond what was necessary, refusing to perform gratitude or hostility, determined not to reward what she assumed would be a temporary indulgence. Alaric, for his part, made no attempt to prolong the exchange beyond its natural end, offering neither promise nor farewell that might be misconstrued. When he stepped away, it was with the same deliberateness with which he had approached, leaving behind a disturbance that lingered far longer than his presence. Seraphina remained still after he left, acutely aware of the unfamiliar sensation tightening her chest. It was not attraction, nor relief, but something more disquieting, the realization that she had been addressed without caution, without expectation, and without fear. She dismissed the feeling as anomaly, a lapse in judgment on his part that would soon be corrected. Men like him did not court complication, they did not ignore warnings without cause. Yet as the evening wore on, she found her attention straying despite herself, tracking his movements, noting the consistency of his restraint. By the time she departed, one truth had settled uncomfortably into place. Whatever had prompted the Duke of Ravensmere to approach her, it was not curiosity alone, and it was not finished. The consequences of the Duke of Ravensmere's attention unfolded with a speed Seraphina had learned to recognize as dangerous. By the following morning, the careful neutrality that usually surrounded her name had shifted into something sharper, more alert, as though society itself had drawn a collective breath. Conversations halted when she entered rooms, then resumed with a new edge once she passed, speculation threaded with unease. She did not need to hear the words to know their shape. Why had he approached her? What did he intend? How long before he corrected the mistake? Seraphina absorbed the scrutiny with outward calm, yet beneath it, a familiar tension coiled, the instinctive preparation for retreat that had preserved her for years. She told herself that Alaric Thornwick's interest would fade. Men of position did not invite controversy without reason, and reason always yielded to consequence in the end. She assumed he would be reminded, firmly if necessary, of what association with her cost. When that reminder came, he would withdraw politely, perhaps with a regret he would never voice. This expectation steadied her. Abandonment, when anticipated, hurt less. What unsettled her instead was the absence of any visible retreat. Days passed, then another public engagement, and still he did not distance himself. He neither sought her out with insistence nor erased their prior exchange with avoidance. His consistency was quiet, unannounced, and therefore impossible to interpret. Alaric, meanwhile, received the reaction exactly as he had expected. Advisers spoke with increasing urgency, some appealing to prudence, others to legacy. They warned him that fascination often masqueraded as principle, that reputations such as Seraphina's were not accidents but inevitabilities. He listened without interruption, as he always did, weighing not only the arguments but the fear beneath them. What struck him was not concern for his welfare, but certainty that she was unworthy of defense. That certainty, offered so freely, hardened his resolve. He had not yet chosen her, not in the way they implied, but he refused to participate in a dismissal so casually sustained. When Seraphina encountered him again, the tension between expectation and reality tightened further. She watched him carefully this time, searching for signs of calculation or fatigue. Finding none, she sharpened her distance instead, answering him with polite brevity, keeping her composure rigidly intact. She would not be caught hoping. Hope had always been the most punishing mistake. Alaric accepted her restraint without offense, as though he understood its purpose. The space between them became charged not by pursuit, but by patience, each step measured, each silence deliberate. By the end of the week, it was no longer possible to pretend nothing had changed. Society had noticed, and Seraphina felt the familiar pressure of becoming a problem to be resolved. What neither she nor Alaric yet acknowledged aloud was that the pattern had already shifted. He had not withdrawn. She had not fled. Between them, something tenuous and dangerous had taken shape, not born of defiance, but of a mutual refusal to behave as expected. Duke Alaric Thornwick did not confront rumour by arguing with it. He had learned early that rumour thrived on resistance, growing more elaborate each time it was denied. Instead, he approached it as he approached any unresolved matter of consequence, by tracing its origin and observing who benefited from its persistence. What he discovered, quietly and without announcement, unsettled him more than the warnings ever had. Records requested under unrelated pretenses revealed inconsistencies, dates that aligned too conveniently, testimonies softened into ambiguity, and omissions so precise they could not have been accidental. The tragedy that had bound itself to Seraphina Ashcombe's name was not a mystery in the traditional sense. It was a rearrangement, a careful shifting of responsibility away from those whose influence rendered them untouchable, and onto someone who could be isolated without resistance. Each fragment he uncovered sharpened his perception of her composure. What others dismissed as coldness revealed itself as discipline refined under pressure. She had not survived because she was hardened by nature, but because she had learned to contain pain where it could not be exploited. Alaric recognized that kind of restraint intimately. It was the restraint of someone who understood that justice was rarely volunteered, and that dignity, once compromised, was nearly impossible to reclaim. His interest, once principled curiosity, deepened into something more deliberate, anchored by respect that did not require her presence to sustain it. Seraphina remained unaware of his investigation, though she sensed a shift she could not name. His attention, when it fell upon her, carried a steadiness that did not waver under scrutiny. He did not observe her as one observes danger, nor as one studies novelty, but with the quiet regard of someone acknowledging reality rather than reputation. This unsettled her more than overt hostility ever had. She had built her defenses to withstand suspicion and avoidance, not fairness. Fairness implied choice, and choice implied the possibility of disappointment. Their interactions remained sparse, bound by circumstance rather than intention, yet each encounter reinforced the same truth. Alaric did not retreat when reminded of consequence. He did not advance when proximity invited speculation. He simply remained, consistent and unyielding, as though proximity to her required no justification. Society noticed this constancy with increasing discomfort. Seraphina noticed it with mounting unease. Somewhere between his quiet resolve and her instinctive withdrawal, a tension formed that neither had invited, yet neither seemed willing to dissolve. The obligation that bound Lady Seraphina Ashcombe and Duke Alaric Thornwick into repeated proximity arrived under the guise of necessity rather than choice, a shared responsibility that could not be declined without attracting precisely the scrutiny both wished to avoid. Seraphina approached the arrangement with immediate resistance, irritation sharpening her composure as she prepared herself for the inevitable strain of enforced interaction. She had survived by controlling distance, by ensuring that no one remained close enough to mistake her silence for invitation. Alaric's presence disrupted that careful balance, not through intrusion, but through its refusal to conform to her expectations. He did not dominate discussion or assert authority where it was unnecessary. Instead, he listened, allowing pauses to exist without filling them, offering observation rather than instruction. This restraint unsettled Seraphina more than condescension ever could. She responded with precision, her intelligence surfacing despite her determination to remain guarded. Each exchange revealed a familiarity with systems and strategy that others had long ignored, and she recognized the shift in how her words were received, not as obligation, but as contribution. The realization unsettled her deeply. She had grown accustomed to being endured, not respected. Internally, Seraphina braced for the inevitable correction, the moment when proximity would be deemed inconvenient and withdrawn. Yet it did not come. Alaric remained measured, neither advancing nor retreating, his attention steady without demand. She found herself observing him in return, noting how little he seemed concerned with performance, how rarely he sought approval. The similarity disturbed her. She recognized in him a discipline born not of privilege alone, but of accountability. By the time the obligation drew to a close, the tension between them had sharpened rather than eased. Seraphina felt the strain of resisting something she could not name, an unfamiliar pull that challenged the isolation she had long mistaken for safety. Alaric, for his part, recognized how quickly she anticipated harm, how instinctively she fortified herself against disappointment. Proximity had not softened their defenses, but it had revealed them, laying bare the fault lines that would not remain hidden much longer. The moment that revealed Seraphina's vulnerability did not arrive with drama or confession, but through exhaustion she had not anticipated and control she could not fully maintain. It came late, when the demands of obligation had finally loosened, and the careful structure she relied upon thinned just enough to allow something real to surface. She had stood too long, listened too intently, carried too much without pause, and when she finally withdrew from the room, the familiar steadiness deserted her for the briefest instant. Alaric noticed immediately, not because she faltered visibly, but because her silence changed, becoming heavier, more deliberate, as though restraint itself had begun to weigh. She did not ask for assistance, nor did she acknowledge the shift, yet she did not stop him when he remained beside her, a moment longer than courtesy required. There was no intrusion in his presence, no question that demanded explanation. He did not reach for her arm or offer reassurance shaped like pity. Instead, he adjusted his pace to hers, allowing the quiet to exist without interpretation. The simplicity of the act unsettled her more deeply than concern ever could. It suggested awareness without entitlement, attention without expectation. For someone accustomed to defending every boundary, this absence of pressure felt dangerously unfamiliar. Seraphina became acutely aware of how alone she had been for so long, not in the absence of company, but in the absence of acknowledgement. The realization did not break her composure, but it cracked something beneath it, a recognition she refused to articulate. Alaric's restraint communicated something she had not permitted herself to imagine, that presence could exist without demand, that regard did not always seek advantage. She felt seen, not exposed, and the distinction unsettled her. When she regained her equilibrium, the moment passed without comment. She straightened, resumed her distance, and thanked him with the faintest inclination of her head, more reflex than gratitude. Alaric accepted this without remark, neither claiming intimacy nor retreating into formality. Yet the shift lingered. For Seraphina, it altered the internal narrative she had relied upon, introducing doubt where certainty had once lived. For Alaric, it confirmed what he had already suspected, that beneath her composure lay a resilience shaped by solitude rather than strength alone. Neither named the change, but both carried it forward, aware that something irreversible had begun. The pressure that followed did not arrive subtly. It came with purpose, carried through carefully chosen intermediaries and framed as concern rather than command, yet its intent was unmistakable. Duke Alaric Thornwick was summoned into conversations that bore the weight of expectation, each one shaped by the same warning delivered with increasing insistence. His association with Lady Seraphina Ashcombe was no longer dismissed as anomaly but treated as liability, something requiring correction before it unsettled alliances already strained by rumor. They spoke of balance and stability, of appearances and long memory, as though these abstractions justified the quiet cruelty of exclusion. Alaric listened, his expression unreadable, absorbing not only their words but the fear beneath them, the urgency with which they sought to restore a pattern he had disturbed. He did not argue. He rarely did when argument served only to reassure those unwilling to hear. Instead, he asked measured questions, inviting them to articulate the substance of their concern. Each response circled the same absence. No evidence, no certainty, only repetition. The more they spoke, the clearer it became that Seraphina's continued isolation had long functioned as convenience, a boundary that spared others from confronting uncomfortable truth. Alaric's silence in response unsettled them more than defiance would have. Silence suggested decision, already forming. Seraphina felt the shift without being told. She recognized it in the tightening of glances, the sharpening of curiosity where indifference had once sufficed. She understood instinctively that she had become axis rather than observer, that whatever protection distance once afforded her was eroding. The knowledge awakened a familiar fear, the certainty that consequence would fall not on those with power, but on her. She prepared herself for the familiar retreat, the inevitable moment when Alaric would be reminded of cost and withdraw accordingly. The anticipation weighed heavier than the act itself ever could. Yet when next they encountered one another, he did not withdraw, nor did he advance in defiance. He greeted her with the same restraint, the same unaltered regard, as though the pressure surrounding him had failed to register. The consistency unsettled her profoundly. She found herself watching him with new intensity, searching for fracture, for hesitation, for any sign that his attention would falter. Finding none, she tightened her own defenses, answering him with crisp precision, determined not to mistake patience for promise. Between them, tension sharpened, no longer born of curiosity but of consequence. The world had noticed. The stakes had shifted. What neither could yet articulate was that neutrality was no longer possible. Whatever followed would demand choice, and choice, once made, would not be easily undone. Seraphina decided that if intention remained unclear, she would force it into the open without asking for explanation. She had survived too long by anticipating disappointment to allow uncertainty to linger unchecked. When next she found herself alone with Alaric, she did not soften her distance or cloak her words in courtesy. Instead, she spoke with the same unvarnished precision she had once used to defend herself against accusation, her tone calm but unyielding as she acknowledged what both of them had been avoiding. His continued presence, she told him, was being noticed. It was drawing attention she neither wanted nor could afford. If his interest was temporary, born of curiosity or contrarian impulse, it would be better for him to withdraw now rather than later, when the cost would be higher for them both. Alaric did not interrupt her. He listened as though her words required no defense, allowing the silence that followed to stretch without filling it with reassurance or denial. When he finally spoke, it was not to justify himself, nor to dismiss her concern. He acknowledged the cost plainly, without minimizing it, and stated only that he did not act without intention. He offered no promises, no assurances of outcome, only the truth that his presence was neither accidental nor provisional. If he withdrew, it would not be because he had been warned. If he remained, it would be by choice. The restraint in his response unsettled her more deeply than any declaration could have. He neither pursued nor retreated, refusing to allow her fear to dictate his behavior. Seraphina felt the familiar urge to harden, to reclaim control through withdrawal, yet something resisted within her, a recognition that she was being met rather than managed. The encounter ended without resolution, tension left deliberately intact. As she turned away, she understood with reluctant clarity that her greatest fear was no longer abandonment, but the possibility that he might remain, and that remaining would demand courage she was not yet certain she possessed. The circumstance that forced genuine cooperation arrived without warning, imposed by necessity rather than design, and left Seraphina little opportunity to retreat into the margins where she had long kept herself intact. The matter required judgment, organization, and a steadiness under pressure that could not be feigned, and for the first time in years, she found herself positioned not as observer but participant. Seraphina approached the task with disciplined focus, setting aside the unease that had shadowed her interactions with Alaric and allowing competence to guide her where caution no longer could. She spoke when clarity was required, offered solutions shaped by experience rather than theory, and did so without apology or ornament. The room listened, some with surprise thinly veiled, others with reluctance, but none could dismiss the effectiveness of her reasoning. Alaric watched without interruption, noting not only what she said but how naturally authority settled around her when she was no longer defending herself. He did not intercede or amplify her words, understanding instinctively that support, in this moment, meant restraint. Seraphina felt the shift almost immediately, the unfamiliar sensation of being heard without resistance or doubt. It unsettled her concentration, forcing her to steady herself against a surge of awareness she refused to name. She had grown accustomed to proving endurance, not capability, and the recognition of her intellect stirred something dangerously close to pride. When the matter concluded, the tension between them had changed shape. It no longer stemmed solely from guarded distance but from an unspoken acknowledgement of equality neither had anticipated. Seraphina withdrew as soon as propriety allowed, her composure intact yet strained by the realization that she had been seen in full, not as rumor or cautionary tale, but as herself. Alaric remained where he was, aware that admiration had deepened into something more personal, something he did not yet permit himself to claim. The balance between them had shifted, subtly but irrevocably, and both understood that the space they now occupied could not be easily abandoned. The insult was delivered with practiced elegance, wrapped in humor sharp enough to draw polite laughter, while leaving its target unmistakably exposed. It was the sort of remark that thrived on plausible denial, crafted so that outrage would seem excessive and silence would be interpreted as consent. Seraphina recognized it instantly, the familiar tightening in her chest preceding the moment when she would usually withdraw, allowing the words to pass unchallenged. She had learned that confrontation only prolonged scrutiny, that dignity was preserved by refusing to react. She lowered her gaze slightly, preparing herself for the familiar aftermath, the quiet satisfaction of those who believed they had spoken truth aloud without consequence. Alaric did not raise his voice. He did not interrupt the laughter or draw attention to himself. Instead, he addressed the remark with measured clarity, correcting the implication without naming it as insult, reframing the falsehood as error rather than offense. His tone remained calm, almost conversational, yet the precision of his words left no ambiguity. The room shifted. What had been dismissed as wit was suddenly revealed as misjudgment, and the laughter faded into an uncomfortable silence. Alaric offered no further commentary, no lingering gaze toward Seraphina that might suggest performance. He simply continued the conversation as though the correction required no acknowledgement. The effect on Seraphina was immediate and disorienting. She felt no rush of triumph, no relief shaped like rescue. What unsettled her was the simplicity of the act, the way it affirmed her dignity without demanding gratitude or intimacy in return. For the first time, someone had defended her without making her the spectacle of the defense. She did not thank him. She did not meet his eyes. She steadied herself against the unfamiliar sensation of being protected, without being diminished. In the days that followed, she found her internal narrative shifting in ways she resisted. The certainty that she must endure everything alone no longer felt absolute. Alaric's action had not erased consequence, but it had altered her perception of worth, introducing the possibility that respect did not require isolation. For Alaric, the cost of his restraint became more visible, as glances sharpened and alliances grew cautious. Yet he accepted this without comment, understanding that once dignity had been affirmed, silence would no longer suffice. The memory returned to Seraphina not as accusation, but as weight, settling into her thoughts with a persistence she could no longer dismiss. She had spent years keeping the past carefully contained, refusing to revisit it except in the quietest corners of her mind, where grief could exist without consequence. Yet Alaric's intervention, so measured and unclaimed, had disturbed the balance she relied upon. It had reminded her that the story she carried was not immutable, that the meaning she assigned to it might not be the only one that mattered. Alone, she allowed herself to remember not the rumors, but the truth as she had lived it, the confusion, the shock, the moment she realized that responsibility was being rearranged, while she stood silently at the center of it. She remembered how quickly expectation had hardened into certainty, how easily others had stepped aside once blame found a convenient resting place. She had been young enough then to believe that truth would surface on its own, that silence would invite fairness. When it did not, she learned instead to carry guilt she did not deserve, believing that endurance was the price of peace. That belief had shaped her more thoroughly than any accusation. It had taught her to accept loneliness as consequence, to treat longing as indulgence, to mistake restraint for resolution. Now, for the first time, she questioned whether survival had come at the cost of self-erasure. The shift frightened her more than bitterness ever had. Bitterness could be contained. Hope could not. She found herself thinking of Alaric not as rescuer or adversary, but as witness, someone who had looked at her without needing her to disappear. The realization stirred a fragile longing she did not trust, a desire not for vindication, but for the freedom to exist without constant defense. She resisted it instinctively, reminding herself how easily such hope could be withdrawn. Yet the thought lingered, persistent and unsettling. By the time she emerged from her solitude, Seraphina understood that something fundamental had changed. She could no longer pretend that endurance alone was sufficient. The past had not loosened its grip, but its meaning had shifted, opening a narrow path towards something she had never allowed herself to imagine. The question was no longer whether she deserved more, but whether she dared to want it. The conversation unfolded without witnesses, without interruption, and without the urgency that usually accompanied moments of consequence. It took place in a quiet interval carved out of obligation, where departure could not be mistaken for avoidance and presence did not invite speculation. Seraphina had not intended to linger, yet when Alaric spoke, not to summon her but simply to observe the stillness of the moment, she remained. The choice felt deliberate in a way that unsettled her, as though she were stepping into something unmarked and therefore dangerous. They spoke first of matters that carried no risk, of responsibility framed as stewardship rather than authority, of decisions shaped by restraint rather than force. Yet beneath the measured exchange, something sharper threaded itself through every word. Seraphina became aware of how easily he listened, not with the expectation of reply, but with the discipline of attention. It was unfamiliar, this sense of being heard without qualification, and it demanded more honesty than she was accustomed to offering. She found herself responding not with the armor of detachment, but with clarity shaped by conviction, revealing values she rarely voiced aloud. Integrity, she said, was not proven by visibility but by consistency. Alaric did not disagree. He added only that restraint was meaningless without courage, that silence could preserve power just as easily as it could betray it. The alignment unsettled her more than conflict would have. She had built her solitude on the assumption that no one would ever fully understand the shape of her choices, that her endurance would always be misread as passivity. To hear her own beliefs echoed back to her, not as flattery but as recognition, disrupted the careful distance she maintained. She felt the tension sharpen between them, not born of flirtation or overt desire, but of something deeper and more perilous, the awareness of shared ground that neither had anticipated. It would have been easier had he reached for her hand, easier had he spoken of admiration or concern. Instead, he maintained the boundary between them with deliberate care, allowing the connection to exist without claim. Alaric felt the restraint acutely. He was aware of the pull, of the temptation to bridge the distance and name what was forming between them, yet he recognized the importance of allowing her agency to remain intact. He did not want her trust born of pressure or gratitude. He wanted it chosen freely, without fear of abandonment or obligation. So he held himself still, anchoring the moment in mutual respect rather than momentum. The choice cost him more than he revealed, yet he accepted it without hesitation. When the conversation drew to a close, neither moved immediately. The silence that followed was not awkward, but weighted, charged with everything left unsaid. Seraphina felt it settle into her chest, the realization that intimacy did not always announce itself through touch or declaration. Sometimes it arrived through recognition, through the dangerous ease of being known. She excused herself at last, her composure intact yet strained by awareness she could not dismiss. As she walked away, she understood with quiet certainty that something irreversible had occurred. Boundaries had been honored, not breached, and in doing so, they had deepened the tension rather than relieving it. Whatever lay ahead would not be undone by distance alone. The shift in atmosphere did not announce itself with confrontation, but with coordination, a tightening of influence that Seraphina recognized instinctively as far more dangerous than open hostility. Invitations altered their tone, obligations were reassigned, and conversations that once skirted her presence now revolved around it with deliberate precision. She felt herself becoming a problem to be managed rather than ignored, a distinction that carried far greater consequence. The past, long dormant but never forgotten, was being stirred with intention, its edges sharpened to serve those who preferred resolution over truth. She understood this pattern well. It was the prelude to erasure disguised as order. Whispers grew more confident, less cautious. Names long silent resurfaced, reshaped to imply certainty where none existed. The tragedy that had defined her reputation was no longer treated as unfortunate ambiguity but as settled narrative, repeated often enough to harden into fact. Seraphina absorbed the escalation with outward composure, though internally she felt the familiar strain of bracing for impact. She had endured this before. She knew how it ended. Isolation would be framed as necessity, distance as protection, and she would be expected to disappear quietly so that balance could be restored without discomfort. What unsettled her most was not the hostility itself, but the knowledge that Alaric now stood within its reach. The cost of proximity to her was no longer theoretical. It was being calculated openly, weighed against alliances and influence. She saw the glances cast his way, the pauses that followed his name, the subtle reminders offered with practiced concern. He was being given opportunities to withdraw with dignity, to correct what others increasingly framed as misjudgment. Seraphina recognized the moment for what it was. The world was preparing to test him, and by extension, her. Her instinct was immediate and decisive. She would not allow herself to become the lever by which his standing was fractured. Endurance had taught her that sacrifice, when offered early, could prevent greater harm. She began, quietly and without announcement, to sever ties that required visibility. Obligations were declined, appearances reduced, correspondence simplified to necessity alone. Each step felt familiar, almost comforting in its predictability. Retreat was something she understood. Retreat was survivable. Alaric noticed the change at once. He did not require explanation to recognize withdrawal shaped by fear rather than choice. Where others saw prudence, he saw resignation, the reflex of someone who had learned that staying always carried greater cost than leaving. The realization unsettled him more deeply than the opposition itself. He had accepted consequence as the price of integrity, but he had not accepted that she would bear it alone. The thought that she would disappear to spare him crystallized something he could no longer ignore. By the time Seraphina convinced herself that withdrawal was necessary, the tension between them had sharpened into inevitability. She believed she was protecting him. He understood that silence would only confirm the injustice he now recognized too clearly to tolerate. The paths they were choosing, though shaped by different instincts, were moving toward collision rather than distance. Whatever followed would no longer be managed through restraint alone. The moment for endurance had reached its limit, and neither of them could step back without surrendering something essential. Seraphina's withdrawal was precise, almost elegant in its execution, a retreat designed to attract as little attention as possible while accomplishing its purpose completely. She reduced her presence without explanation, declined obligations that once required her attendance, and adjusted her routine so that chance encounters became unlikely. To anyone observing from a distance, it appeared prudent, even sensible, the behavior of a woman finally accepting the limits imposed upon her. To Seraphina, it felt like discipline, the familiar act of choosing disappearance before it could be forced upon her. She told herself that she was protecting Alaric, that removing herself from proximity would spare him the fracture of alliances already straining under scrutiny. This belief steadied her, even as it hollowed something vital within her. What she did not allow herself to examine was how thoroughly fear shaped the choice. Not fear of isolation, for she knew that terrain well, but fear of being chosen only temporarily, of discovering that even principled defiance had its threshold. Endurance had taught her that love, when offered at all, was conditional, withdrawn the moment it demanded too much. By leaving first, she preserved the illusion of control. By retreating, she ensured that abandonment would not arrive as surprise. The logic was familiar, rehearsed over years of quiet exits and unspoken goodbyes. It felt responsible. It felt necessary. Alaric recognized the pattern immediately. He had seen it before, not in her specifically, but in those shaped by long exposure to consequence without defense. Withdrawal disguised as strength, sacrifice mistaken for dignity. The realization unsettled him more than the opposition gathering against him. He had expected resistance from society, from those invested in preserving narratives that absolve themselves. He had not expected to confront the cost of his restraint reflected so clearly in her disappearance. The thought that she believed herself expendable sharpened something within him that patience alone could no longer contain. He did not confront her immediately. He understood too well how easily pressure could confirm her fears. Instead, he observed the absence she created, the careful way she erased herself from spaces where she had once stood with quiet resolve. Each absence confirmed the same truth. She was not retreating because she doubted him. She was retreating because she did not trust permanence itself. That distinction mattered more than any accusation leveled against her name. When they finally stood in the same room again, the distance between them was heavier than any crowd. Seraphina held herself with composed finality, as though the decision had already been made and required no discussion. Alaric felt the urgency beneath his restraint, the recognition that silence now would be interpreted not as respect, but as acquiescence. The moment demanded more than patience. It demanded truth. Seraphina believed she was acting with courage. Alaric understood that courage, when shaped entirely by fear, became another form of surrender. Between them, the tension tightened, no longer suspended in possibility, but poised for confrontation. What she intended as protection, he recognized as erasure. What he intended next would not be persuasion nor rescue, but refusal. Refusal to allow her to vanish under the weight of expectations that had already taken too much from her. Alaric did not allow her withdrawal to complete itself. He intercepted it with the same deliberateness, that had marked every choice he made since noticing her, refusing to let absence stand in for resolution. When he sought her out, it was without audience and without urgency that might be mistaken for demand. The setting was neutral, chosen for privacy rather than symbolism, a place where departure could not be interpreted as flight. Seraphina received him with composed politeness, her expression already arranged for finality, as though she had rehearsed the conversation in advance and intended to endure it rather than participate. He did not accuse her of retreat, nor did he speak of the opposition gathering beyond the walls they stood within. Instead, he addressed the belief beneath her decision, naming it with a clarity that left little room for deflection. She believed, he said calmly, that her removal would preserve his position. She believed that proximity to her was a debt he would eventually refuse to pay. He did not frame this as reproach, only recognition, yet the precision of it struck harder than any raised voice could have. Seraphina stiffened, the instinctive response of someone accustomed to defending choices shaped by necessity. She did not deny it. Denial would have been dishonest. She spoke then, not in anger, but with controlled resolve, explaining that endurance had taught her to anticipate the moment when consequence outweighed intention. She would not be the reason alliances fractured or authority weakened. She had accepted long ago that survival required distance, that remaining visible beyond tolerance only sharpened cruelty. Her withdrawal, she insisted, was not fear, but responsibility. The argument had sustained her for years, and she offered it now with the certainty of something proven through repetition. Alaric listened without interruption. When she finished, he allowed a brief silence to settle, not as hesitation, but as acknowledgement of what she had revealed. Then he spoke with a directness that startled her. He told her that his choices were not provisional, that he did not remain where he had been warned away unless he had already weighed the cost. He did not promise ease or immunity from consequence. He offered only truth. If he withdrew, it would be because he chose to. If he remained, it would not be out of stubbornness or curiosity, but conviction. Her disappearance would not protect him. It would only confirm the injustice he had already refused to accept. The restraint in his voice carried more weight than any declaration could have. He did not ask her to stay. He did not frame himself as indispensable. He simply refused to allow her to erase herself on the assumption that she was expendable. The implication unsettled her deeply. For years, she had defined strength as the ability to remove herself before she was removed. To hear that logic challenged without judgment exposed how tightly fear had shaped her understanding of courage. When the conversation ended, nothing was resolved, yet everything had shifted. Seraphina did not retreat further, nor did she advance. She stood suspended between instinct and possibility, uncertain which demanded greater bravery. Alaric left her there deliberately, aware that pressure would only reinforce the very patterns he sought to disrupt. What he had offered was not reassurance, but recognition. Whether she accepted it would determine not only what followed, but who she allowed herself to become. The moment lingered between them like a held breath neither had fully released, heavy with words shaped but not spoken, intention restrained by timing rather than doubt. Seraphina felt it acutely after Alaric departed, the sense that something essential had been exposed without being resolved. His refusal to accept her erasure unsettled the careful equilibrium she had constructed, leaving her without the familiar refuge of certainty. She told herself that the interruption of clarity was temporary, that distance would reassert itself once circumstances demanded it, yet the thought rang hollow. Something had shifted beyond retrieval, and no amount of discipline could return her to ignorance of it. They met again sooner than expected, not by design but circumstance, drawn into proximity by obligations that did not allow retreat. The air between them felt charged, awareness sharpened by what remained unsaid. Seraphina sensed the edge of confession, hovering just beneath restraint, the dangerous possibility that if either of them spoke too plainly, there would be no way back to the safety of ambiguity. She felt the urge to protect herself rise instinctively, yet it no longer carried the authority it once had. Fear and longing pressed equally, each demanding precedence. Alaric recognized the fragility of the moment with clarity that tightened his restraint. He understood how easily pressure could become coercion, how quickly confession could be interpreted as demand. He did not want her agreement born of exhaustion or gratitude. He wanted it chosen freely, without fear of abandonment or obligation. Yet silence carried its own risk. The longer intention remained unspoken, the more easily circumstance could distort it. He stood at the threshold between restraint and revelation, aware that timing mattered as much as truth. The interruption arrived without warning, abrupt and unavoidable, cutting through the tension with the sharpness of necessity. Responsibility demanded attention elsewhere, drawing Alaric away before the moment could find resolution. The separation felt almost physical, the space widening between them before either could close it. Seraphina felt the loss immediately, the familiar ache of unfinished things, sharpened by the knowledge that this time, the incompletion was not born of indifference, it was born of restraint, and that made it harder to endure. Left alone, she interpreted the interruption through the lens she knew best, convincing herself that inevitability had intervened before hope could solidify. Perhaps it was better this way, she reasoned, better to remain uncertain than to confront the cost of clarity. Yet the argument felt increasingly thin. She had seen his resolve too clearly to dismiss it as impulse, and that recognition unsettled her more deeply than disappointment ever could. For Alaric, the interruption sharpened urgency rather than relieving it. The fragility of the moment underscored how easily circumstance could undo what had not yet been claimed. He recognized that restraint, while principled, could become another form of avoidance if allowed to persist too long. The balance between patience and action narrowed, demanding precision he had not anticipated. When next they spoke, silence would no longer suffice. The unresolved tension settled into both of them, not dissipating with distance but intensifying. Words withheld gained weight rather than fading, and the space between them became charged with everything that had nearly been spoken. Whatever followed would no longer be shaped by caution alone. The moment had passed, but its consequences had not, and neither could return unchanged to the safety of before. The reckoning arrived with the precision of something long prepared, its timing too exact to be coincidence. What had once lingered as implication hardened abruptly into accusation, reshaped and presented as inevitability rather than choice. Names were spoken with renewed confidence, details rearranged to suggest clarity where none had ever existed, and Seraphina's past was lifted from silence and displayed as explanation for present discomfort. The tragedy that had followed her for years was no longer treated as unfortunate ambiguity, but as settled truth, repeated often enough to sound authoritative. It was not justice being pursued, but closure, the kind that demanded a scapegoat so that others might remain unexamined. Seraphina received the renewed scrutiny with the composure she had refined through years of endurance. Outwardly, nothing changed. She moved through rooms with the same measured grace, answered questions with the same restraint, and offered no defense that might invite further spectacle. Inwardly, something fractured. The old wound, long scarred but never healed, split open under the weight of repetition. She had carried guilt she did not deserve for so long that the return of blame felt almost familiar, yet familiarity did not dull the pain. What wounded her most was not the accusation itself, but the certainty with which it was delivered, as though her endurance had been mistaken for admission. She recognized the pattern immediately. Those who had benefited from silence now required reaffirmation of it. Responsibility, once carefully displaced, was being secured anew by making her story unavoidable. The cruelty lay not in invention, but in insistence, in the refusal to reconsider what had already proven convenient. Seraphina understood that this moment marked the limit of isolation as survival. Endurance could no longer contain the damage. The cost of silence had grown too high, not only for her, but for anyone who stood near her now. Alaric witnessed the escalation with clarity that stripped away any remaining illusion of neutrality. He saw how quickly implication hardened into authority when repeated by those accustomed to being believed. He recognized the strategy beneath the spectacle, the calculated effort to force retreat through exhaustion rather than confrontation. The realization settled heavily. Restraint, once principled, now threatened to become complicity. He understood that silence would no longer be interpreted as patience, but agreement. When Seraphina learned of the extent to which her past was being wielded against her, she did not seek Alaric immediately. Instinct urged her toward withdrawal, the familiar logic of disappearance resurfacing with persuasive force. Yet something resisted this time. She had seen too clearly how absence only invited narrative to solidify unchecked. The knowledge frightened her, because it demanded a response she had never allowed herself to consider. To remain visible now would require courage of a different kind, one not shaped by endurance, but by refusal. By the end of the day, it was clear that the line had been crossed. What had been whispered was now declared. What had been endured could no longer be contained. The world had chosen its version of truth. The question that remained, sharp and unavoidable, was whether Seraphina would continue to carry it alone, or whether Alaric would finally act in a way that could not be reinterpreted as restraint. The decision did not arrive as revelation, nor did it carry the drama others might have expected. It formed quietly, with the steady inevitability of something long considered and finally accepted. Alaric Thornwick had always understood that power preserved itself through silence as much as command, that alliances survived by choosing which truths to ignore. For years, he had navigated that reality with discipline, believing that restraint allowed influence to be exercised where it mattered most. Now, watching Seraphina's past reshaped into justification for present cruelty, he recognized the boundary he could no longer cross without surrendering something essential. Silence, in this moment, would no longer signify prudence. It would signify consent. He felt the weight of consequence clearly. To act openly would fracture relationships cultivated over decades, destabilize arrangements that relied on his predictability, and invite retaliation from those who had mistaken his restraint for compliance. The cost would not be abstract. It would be immediate, personal, and lasting. Yet as he measured these risks, another truth sharpened with equal clarity. If he allowed injustice to proceed unchecked, he would preserve his position at the expense of his integrity, and that loss would be irreparable. Authority retained through betrayal of principle was authority emptied of meaning. Seraphina, meanwhile, stood at the edge of another familiar precipice. The renewed accusations pressed in from all sides, inviting the same response that had once preserved her. Withdrawal tempted her with its certainty, offering escape from confrontation at the price of continued erasure. Yet this time, endurance felt insufficient. She had seen too much, felt too deeply the cost of silence, to retreat without resistance. Still, she did not yet know how to stand without surrendering herself to further harm. She waited, not passively, but with the wary awareness of someone who understood that whatever followed would redefine her life irrevocably. Alaric did not consult advisors before acting. He did not seek consensus or soften his intent through cautionary phrasing. The choice he faced was not one that could be delegated or diluted. When he moved, it was with purpose stripped of ornament, aligning himself with Seraphina in a way that could not be dismissed as courtesy or misinterpretation. He accepted that this alignment would be read as challenge, as declaration, as defiance of narratives long protected by convenience. He accepted it because acceptance was the only remaining option. The impact was immediate. Conversations faltered, alliances recalibrated, and assumptions shattered under the weight of a choice that refused ambiguity. Alaric felt the shift as something physical, the sudden awareness that there would be no return to neutrality, no quiet retreat into influence exercised from behind the veil of restraint. He had crossed the threshold willingly, knowing that whatever followed would demand constancy rather than correction. For Seraphina, the realization arrived with stunned clarity. She had expected abandonment, not alignment, withdrawal rather than commitment. The shock unsettled her more deeply than rejection ever could. Being chosen openly, without qualification or apology, forced her to confront fears she had long kept contained. The world had not softened, the cost had not diminished. But something had changed fundamentally. She was no longer standing alone, and the choice before her now was not how to endure, but how to respond to being claimed without condition. Alaric's alignment was unmistakable not because it was loud, but because it was irreversible. He did not issue proclamations or frame his choice as defense. Instead, he acted in a manner that bound his standing to Seraphina's without qualification, weaving her presence into decisions and appearances that could not be undone without public rupture. It was a commitment expressed through structure rather than speech, through consequence rather than declaration. Those who witnessed it understood immediately that this was not impulse. It was intention made visible. The response was swift and uneven. Some reacted with disbelief, others with thinly veiled disapproval, and a few with opportunistic silence as they recalculated loyalties. The carefully maintained equilibrium fractured, exposing fault lines long concealed beneath courtesy. Alaric accepted the disruption without explanation, neither defending his choice nor seeking approval. He had measured the cost and chosen it deliberately. To retreat now would render the act meaningless, and he did not make meaningless gestures. Seraphina was unprepared for the reality of being chosen so openly. For years, she had anticipated abandonment with the certainty of habit, believing that proximity to her would always prove temporary once consequence asserted itself. To see Alaric remain, not in defiance but in calm continuity, unsettled the foundations of that belief. She felt the familiar urge to minimize herself rise instinctively, to create distance where expectation had always demanded it. Yet the attempt faltered. His steadiness offered no opening for retreat without acknowledging that it was fear, not necessity, guiding her. She found herself observed differently now, no longer as isolated anomaly but as counterpart to a decision that carried weight. The scrutiny did not ease. If anything, it sharpened. Yet it no longer belonged to her alone. The burden was shared, and that distinction altered how it pressed upon her. For the first time, endurance was not her sole refuge. The realization frightened her, because it demanded response rather than retreat. Alaric did not attempt to reassure her with words. He understood too well that reassurance could become pressure, that promises offered too easily could feel like obligation rather than choice. Instead, he remained consistent, allowing time to do what persuasion could not. His presence communicated what speech might have complicated, that his alignment was not conditional, nor was it framed as rescue. He had chosen partnership, not protection. The world reacted as worlds always did when long-held narratives were disrupted. Some hardened, others softened, and many waited to see which way power would settle. Seraphina felt the weight of that waiting acutely. She had spent years being shaped by others' expectations. Now she stood within the consequence of a choice she had not made, yet one that centered her all the same. The question before her was no longer whether she would be abandoned, but whether she would allow herself to remain present in a life that demanded visibility. By the end of the day, the certainty that had once governed her actions had fractured beyond repair. Alaric's choice had altered the terrain irrevocably. Whatever followed would require her to meet it not with disappearance, but with courage of a kind she had never been permitted to practice. Trust did not arrive for Seraphina with relief or gratitude, but with suspicion sharpened by long memory. Alaric's public alignment, so deliberate and unqualified, unsettled her far more than the hostility it provoked. She had learned to read the arc of attention with precision, to anticipate the moment when consequence outweighed conviction, and even the most principled resolve retreated. Now she watched him closely, searching not for affection but for fracture, for the subtle signs of fatigue or regret that would confirm what experience had taught her to expect. Each day that passed without withdrawal only deepened her unease, as though steadiness itself were the greater threat. She told herself that constancy could still be temporary, that endurance on his part did not guarantee permanence. The world had not softened. Opposition remained sharp, alliances uncertain, and the cost of his choice continued to surface in small, relentless ways. Seraphina observed each consequence with growing tension, bracing herself for the moment when he would decide that integrity had reached its limit. That decision, she believed, would come quietly, framed as necessity rather than abandonment. Preparing for it felt safer than believing in what had been offered. Alaric did not confront her suspicion directly. He understood its origin too well to dismiss it as ingratitude or fear alone. Instead, he allowed her distance to exist without interpreting it as rejection. He neither demanded reassurance nor sought confirmation of her faith. His patience was deliberate, grounded in the understanding that trust could not be argued into existence. It had to be practiced, proven through consistency rather than promise. This restraint, offered without expectation, unsettled her more deeply than any declaration could have. The tension between them shifted inward, becoming less about external opposition and more about the quiet battle Seraphina waged within herself. She recognized the pattern she was repeating, the instinct to withhold belief until loss confirmed it. Yet something resisted now, a growing awareness that mistrust, while protective, also demanded a cost. Each moment she held herself apart, reinforced the isolation she claimed to despise. The realization frightened her because it placed responsibility not on the world's cruelty, but on her own fear. There were moments when she caught herself imagining a future not governed by retreat, a life shaped by presence rather than endurance. These moments were fleeting, quickly restrained, yet their very existence unsettled the certainty she had relied upon for years. She had survived by believing that attachment inevitably led to loss. Now she faced the possibility that refusal to attach might be another form of surrender. By the end of the segment, trust remained unresolved, suspended between instinct and evidence. Alaric continued to stand beside her without pressure or claim, his consistency offering neither reassurance nor escape. Seraphina remained wary, her fear unyielding, yet beneath it stirred a fragile recognition. For the first time, the question was not whether she would be abandoned, but whether she would allow herself to believe that staying was possible. The separation did not arrive as punishment, nor was it framed as retreat, yet its weight settled heavily all the same. Circumstance intervened with the inevitability of obligation, drawing Alaric away to confront the fractures his decision had created. Matters of influence and consequence demanded his presence elsewhere, responsibilities that could not be deferred without compounding the very instability his alignment with Seraphina had provoked. The distance that opened between them was measured and temporary, yet Seraphina felt it with an intensity that surprised her. She had lived with absence all her life. What unsettled her now was not distance itself, but the meaning she instinctively assigned to it. Silence, once her refuge, began to feel precarious. Each day without his presence invited the familiar logic of inevitability to resurface. This, she told herself, was how it always unfolded. Commitment yielded to consequence, and steadiness gave way to necessity. She resisted the thought even as it took shape, reminding herself that this separation had been neither abrupt nor evasive. Yet fear was persistent, skilled at reshaping uncertainty into expectation. She watched the world carefully, noting how swiftly opinion recalibrated, how easily narratives adapted to his absence. The knowledge tightened around her chest, convincing her that disappearance, once again, would be the least damaging choice. Yet something had changed within her that refused to cooperate with retreat. She felt it in the way absence clarified what presence had altered, in the recognition that she no longer wished to return to the safety of invisibility. The thought frightened her more than isolation ever had. Wanting required risk. Wanting made loss sharper. Still, she could not deny the truth revealed by distance, that his steadiness had reshaped her understanding of what was possible. The realization left her exposed, stripped of the certainty endurance once provided. For Alaric, separation carried its own reckoning. Removed from her immediate presence, he felt the magnitude of what he stood to lose with startling clarity. The weight of opposition pressed harder now, emboldened by distance, each challenge framed as opportunity to correct what others still labeled misjudgment. He met these pressures with the same restraint that had defined his choice, refusing to dilute alignment into compromise. Yet the absence sharpened something within him as well, clarifying that what he had chosen was no longer abstract principle but personal commitment. The thought of returning to a life shaped by calculated distance felt untenable. Neither reached for reassurance during this separation. There were no promises exchanged to soften the distance, no assurances offered to ease the waiting. The silence between them was deliberate, shaped by respect rather than neglect, yet it tested them both. For Seraphina, it forced confrontation with the depth of her attachment and the fear that accompanied it. For Alaric, it affirmed that the cost he had accepted was not theoretical, but deeply personal. When they finally stood poised to reunite, both understood that the separation had altered the terrain between them. Distance had not weakened what existed, it had clarified it. Whatever followed would no longer be shaped by uncertainty alone, but by the knowledge of what absence had revealed. The truth did not surface dramatically, nor did it arrive with vindication shaped like triumph. It emerged instead through accumulation, quiet and methodical, pieced together from testimony long dismissed, records long ignored, and voices finally willing to speak once consequence no longer shielded them. What had once been scattered, fragments hardened into coherence, revealing a pattern that could no longer be denied. Responsibility, so carefully displaced years before, returned to its rightful place, exposing how Seraphina had been positioned not as culprit, but as convenience. The tragedy that had defined her life was revealed for what it had always been, the result of choices made by others and protected by influence that demanded a sacrificial distance. Seraphina received this truth not with relief, but with disorientation. For years, she had carried guilt not because she believed herself responsible, but because accepting blame had been easier than fighting inevitability. Endurance had demanded that she internalize the narrative imposed upon her, shaping herself around it, until survival became indistinguishable from surrender. Now, confronted with clarity, she felt the foundation of that identity fracture. The release was not gentle. It was destabilizing, stripping away a burden she had learned to bear and leaving her uncertain how to stand without it. Grief surfaced anew, not only for the tragedy itself, but for the years shaped by misjudgment and silence. She mourned the self she might have been had truth been allowed to exist sooner, the relationships foreclosed by reputation, the ease she had never known. Yet beneath the grief stirred something unfamiliar, a sense of liberation tempered by fear. If she was not defined by blame, then she was no longer bound by the logic that had governed her endurance. Choice, once constrained by necessity, now stood open before her, demanding courage rather than compliance. Alaric witnessed her reckoning with quiet awareness. He did not frame the truth as rescue or victory, understanding instinctively that revelation did not erase pain. Instead, he allowed space for her to process the shift without imposing interpretation. His presence was steady, unclaimed, offering neither direction nor expectation. He recognized that this moment belonged to her alone, that reclamation of self could not be guided without becoming another form of control. As the truth circulated, society recalibrated with visible discomfort. Those who had relied upon certainty now retreated into silence or justification, unwilling to confront the implications of their complicity. Vindication did not arrive as apology or restoration, but as something subtler and more enduring, the quiet collapse of a narrative that could no longer sustain itself. Seraphina observed this shift without seeking validation. She no longer needed it. By the end of the segment, she understood with clarity that the past had not lost its power, but it had lost its authority. The truth did not rewrite history, yet it redefined her relationship to it. For the first time, Seraphina stood not as survivor of blame, but as architect of her own future. The question before her was no longer how to endure what had been done to her, but how to live now that endurance was no longer her only option. Alaric did not choose the moment for declaration. It arrived instead as a consequence of everything that had been held in restraint for too long, surfacing not through urgency but necessity. The truth of Seraphina's past had unsettled more than public narrative. It had shifted something fundamental between them, clearing the space where silence once stood as protection. When they spoke, it was without ceremony, without witnesses, and without the careful distance that had defined so much of what came before. The quiet between them carried weight now, not as uncertainty, but as readiness. He did not speak of love as promise or rescue. He spoke of it as fact, stated with the same composure that governed every decision he made. His words were measured, stripped of flourish, offered without demand or expectation of response. He told her that what he felt had not formed suddenly, nor had it been shaped by opposition or pity. It had grown through observation, through respect, through the recognition of her strength long before truth made it visible to others. He acknowledged the cost of choosing her, not as burden but as reality already accepted. There was no urgency in his tone, no insistence that she respond in kind. The truth stood on its own, offered freely, and without condition. Seraphina received the admission with a stillness that surprised her. She had imagined this moment in other forms, shaped by fear or longing, yet reality arrived quieter and more unsettling than expectation. His love did not demand reassurance or certainty. It did not seek to persuade her out of caution or doubt. It existed independently of her acceptance, and that frightened her more than anything else could have. For so long, attachment had been transactional, withdrawn, when consequence outweighed desire. Now she faced something that did not retreat in the face of risk, something that asked nothing except honesty. Fear rose instinctively, sharp and practiced, urging her toward distance. Yet it no longer carried unquestioned authority. The truth of her past had stripped away the logic that once governed her endurance, leaving her without the familiar refuge of inevitability. She recognized that refusing his love would no longer be an act of protection alone. It would be a choice shaped by fear rather than necessity. The realization unsettled her deeply. She did not answer him immediately. Silence stretched, not awkward, but weighted with everything she was being asked to confront within herself. Alaric did not fill it. He understood too well that pressure would only replicate the patterns she had already survived. His restraint, even now, honored her agency more profoundly than any promise could have. It told her that whatever she chose would be respected, that love, if accepted, would not become obligation. By the time she spoke, her voice remained composed, yet something within it had shifted. She did not declare certainty or devotion. She acknowledged fear, named it without apology, and admitted that courage had never come easily to her. Yet beneath the fear, she recognized the truth she could no longer deny. What stood before her was not danger disguised as affection, but love offered without erasure. The moment did not resolve everything. It did something more enduring. It placed the choice where it belonged, firmly in her hands, and trusted her enough to let it remain there. The choice did not arrive for Seraphina as certainty, but as resolve shaped slowly beneath fear. In the days that followed Alaric's admission, she felt the familiar impulse to retreat rise again and again, urging her toward the safety of refusal. Acceptance, she knew, would expose her to loss in ways endurance never had. Yet the truth she had reclaimed about her past had altered the foundation beneath that instinct. She could no longer pretend that withdrawal was the only form of strength available to her. To refuse now would not be preservation alone. It would be surrender to the fear that had governed too much of her life already. She considered carefully what acceptance would require. Not gratitude, not dependence, not the quiet erasure of herself in exchange for protection. What Alaric had offered was partnership, unclaimed and uncoerced, grounded in respect rather than rescue. To choose him meant choosing visibility, allowing herself to remain present even when consequence followed. The thought unsettled her deeply, yet beneath the unease stirred something steadier than fear, a recognition that courage was not the absence of dread, but the refusal to be ruled by it. When she finally sought him out, it was without audience or ceremony. Her manner was composed, her voice calm, yet the weight of what she intended to say pressed heavily within her. She did not soften the truth or disguise her hesitation. She told him plainly that she was afraid, that years of misjudgment had taught her to expect loss where attachment formed. She acknowledged that trust did not come easily to her, and that belief in permanence felt almost foreign. Yet she did not allow those truths to stand as barriers. She named them as realities she was willing to face rather than flee. Alaric listened with the same restraint that had defined every step between them. He did not interrupt, nor did he attempt to reassure her out of what she confessed. When she finished, she did not ask for promise or protection. She offered something far more vulnerable. She chose him. Not because fear had vanished, but because fear would no longer dictate her life. The choice was quiet, unadorned, yet irrevocable in its clarity. The moment marked a profound shift within her. For the first time, she was not enduring circumstance or reacting to threat. She was acting from desire aligned with self-trust. The decision did not erase uncertainty, but it grounded her in agency she had long been denied. She felt no rush of triumph, only a deep, steady awareness that she had stepped into something new, without surrendering herself in the process. Alaric received her choice without claiming it as victory. He did not frame her acceptance as resolution or reward. He acknowledged it as partnership, meeting her decision with equal commitment rather than expectation. There were no declarations, no assurances shaped like guarantees. What passed between them was something quieter and more enduring, the mutual recognition that love, chosen freely, did not diminish strength, but refined it. By the end of the segment, Seraphina understood that courage had not transformed her into someone unafraid. It had allowed her to remain present, despite fear. She had chosen not only Alaric, but herself, stepping forward not as a woman rescued from exile, but as one who claimed her place without apology. The opposition did not dissolve simply because Seraphina chose courage, nor did it retreat in the face of truth now exposed. Instead, it gathered itself for one final attempt, sharper and more deliberate than before, driven by the understanding that what had once relied on silence now faced resistance. Influence was applied with renewed precision, pressure exerted through channels designed to fracture rather than confront. The aim was no longer merely to isolate Seraphina, but to sever what had formed between her and Alaric by making unity itself untenable. The tactics were familiar to Seraphina, though she now saw them with a clarity she had never permitted herself before. Rumors were revived and reframed, not to accuse outright, but to exhaust, to suggest that peace could only be restored through separation. Offers were made quietly, compromises disguised as generosity, each carrying the same implication: withdraw, and stability will return. Endurance would once have urged her to comply, to absorb the cost quietly and spare others the discomfort of conflict. This time, she did not yield to that instinct. She recognized the strategy for what it was, not an appeal to reason, but an attempt to reclaim control. Alaric faced pressure of his own, more overt and less patient. Authority was challenged under the guise of concern, his judgment questioned with increasing boldness as others tested whether his resolve would fracture under sustained opposition. He met these challenges without escalation, refusing to negotiate away what he had already chosen. What surprised many was not his defiance, but his composure. He did not frame his stance as sacrifice, nor did he shield Seraphina behind authority. He stood beside her, visibly and without apology, allowing partnership rather than protection to define their response. For the first time, Seraphina did not retreat into silence when the pressure intensified. She did not speak defensively or seek to justify herself. Instead, she remained present, her composure no longer shaped by endurance alone, but by self-possession. The shift unsettled those accustomed to her withdrawal. Resistance had relied upon her absence to function. Her refusal to disappear disrupted the entire pattern. The experience solidified something between them that had not yet been tested under direct threat. Facing opposition together clarified the nature of their bond more decisively than any confession could have. They did not strategize endlessly or seek reassurance in private. They trusted the steadiness they had already chosen, allowing it to guide them through uncertainty rather than reacting to each provocation. The simplicity of this unity proved disarming. What could not provoke fear found itself without leverage. By the end of the segment, the final attempt to dismantle their bond had failed not through confrontation, but through irrelevance. The opposition had expended its force without achieving its aim. Seraphina recognized the moment with quiet astonishment. She had not survived by retreating. She had endured by standing. The realization altered her understanding of strength irrevocably. As the pressure eased, not vanishing but diminishing, she understood that the greatest threat had never been the world's cruelty, but her belief that she must face it alone. Now, standing beside Alaric by choice rather than necessity, she knew that whatever followed would no longer be shaped by fear or silence. The bond between them had proven itself not fragile, but resilient, capable of withstanding scrutiny without surrender. Seraphina chose the moment deliberately, not because it promised safety, but because it demanded clarity. The gathering itself was unremarkable, assembled under the familiar pretense of civility and obligation, yet beneath its polished surface lay the residue of recent conflict, unspoken and unresolved. She felt it as she entered, the subtle tightening of attention, the careful glances cast in her direction, measuring whether she would remain silent as she always had. This time, she did not. She stood beside Alaric openly, not shielded by his presence, not receding into his shadow, but aligned with him as equal, rather than consequence. When she spoke, her voice did not rise, nor did it seek permission. She did not recount the past in detail, or invite sympathy through explanation. Instead, she framed her history with restraint and precision, naming what had been proven without embellishment and refusing to apologize for what had never been her burden to bear. The power of her words lay not in revelation, but in composure. She did not argue against rumor. She rendered it irrelevant. By claiming her narrative without defensiveness, she removed the leverage that had sustained her isolation for so long. The reaction was immediate and uneven. Some listened with discomfort thinly veiled as politeness, others with visible recalibration as certainty faltered. What unsettled them most was not the truth itself, but the way she occupied space while speaking it. This was not the woman they had dismissed so easily, not the figure shaped by endurance and absence. This was someone grounded, unyielding without aggression, present without apology. Alaric remained beside her throughout, attentive but silent, allowing her words to stand without reinforcement. His restraint underscored the truth more effectively than defense ever could. Seraphina felt the shift as something internal as well as external. Speaking without retreat altered her relationship to her own voice, transforming it from instrument of survival into expression of agency. She did not feel triumphant. She felt steady. The difference mattered. Triumph depended on opposition. Steadiness required none. As she concluded, she did not seek response or validation. She simply remained, allowing the weight of what had been said to settle without attempting to manage its effect. In the moments that followed, the room adjusted around her. Conversations resumed cautiously, recalibrated by the knowledge that the narrative they had relied upon no longer held. The absence of confrontation denied them the satisfaction of resistance. There was nothing to push against, nothing to correct. Seraphina's presence was no longer a problem to be solved, but a reality to be acknowledged. The realization unsettled those invested in her disappearance more than anger ever could. Later, when they withdrew from the gathering, the air between Seraphina and Alaric felt altered, not charged with tension but grounded in quiet affirmation. She had stood publicly without leaning on him, and in doing so, had claimed something neither of them could have offered her alone. Alaric did not praise or comment. He understood that acknowledgement would cheapen what she had accomplished. Instead, he met her gaze with recognition, an unspoken understanding that what had shifted could not be reversed. By the end of the night, Seraphina knew with certainty that she had reclaimed more than her reputation. She had reclaimed authorship of her own life, Standing beside Alaric was no longer an act of defiance or refuge. It was choice, made visible without fear. Whatever future awaited them would unfold from this moment forward, shaped not by warning or rumor, but by the steadiness of two people who had refused to disappear. The cost did not announce itself with catastrophe, but with permanence, settling quietly into the spaces where certainty once lived. Alliances shifted without ceremony, some dissolving entirely, others reforming into shapes that no longer offered comfort or familiarity. Doors that had once opened with ease now required intention, and certain invitations simply ceased to arrive. Seraphina noticed these changes with an awareness sharpened by long experience, yet they did not strike her with the old sense of loss. What had been forfeited was never freely given to begin with. The difference now was that the price had been paid knowingly, not extracted through fear. Alaric absorbed the consequences with the same restraint that had guided his choice. Authority did not vanish, but it recalibrated, shedding those who had mistaken his consistency for compliance. Power narrowed, becoming more honest for its limitation. He felt the weight of it daily, the quiet adjustments required to navigate a landscape less forgiving than before. Yet beneath the inconvenience lay a steadiness he had not anticipated, the clarity that came from no longer negotiating integrity against acceptance. What remained was leaner, but it was his. For Seraphina, the most disorienting cost was internal. The absence of constant vigilance left space she did not yet know how to fill. She had spent so long anticipating rejection that peace felt unfamiliar, almost precarious. There were moments when she reached instinctively for the armor of endurance, only to find it unnecessary. The realization unsettled her, forcing her to confront how deeply fear had shaped her understanding of safety. She was no longer surviving. She was living within consequence by choice, and that distinction demanded adjustment. Together, they grieved what had been lost without romanticizing it. There was no pretense that sacrifice had elevated them beyond discomfort. Some nights were marked by exhaustion, by the awareness that standing openly carried an ongoing cost. Yet those moments were met with honesty rather than regret. Neither suggested retreat as solution. The idea no longer held power. They had crossed beyond it. Society responded as societies often did when confronted with permanence. Resistance softened into accommodation, outrage into fatigue. What could not be undone gradually lost urgency. Seraphina observed this shift without satisfaction or resentment. Acceptance, she understood now, was rarely an apology. It was adjustment, reluctant but inevitable. The narrative that had once defined her began to lose relevance, not because it was forgiven, but because it no longer dictated her absence. In quieter moments, away from scrutiny, Seraphina and Alaric allowed themselves to acknowledge what they had chosen without embellishment. Their bond did not erase difficulty, but it reframed it, transforming burden into shared responsibility. Love, she realized, was not proven by ease, but by the willingness to remain present when ease was no longer offered. The knowledge settled into her with surprising calm. By the end of the segment, the world had not become gentler, but it had become clearer. What remained was not the life she might have imagined in youth, untouched by rumor or cost. It was something more honest, shaped by deliberate choice rather than endurance. Standing within that truth, Seraphina felt a quiet certainty take root. The price had been paid. The ground beneath her feet was no longer borrowed. Whatever came next would be built, not endured. The retreat was not framed as escape, nor did it carry the urgency of recovery demanded by crisis. It was chosen deliberately, a temporary withdrawal from the density of expectation and scrutiny that had marked every recent step. Removed from constant observation, Seraphina felt the quiet differently than she ever had before. Silence no longer pressed against her as judgment or warning. It rested instead as space, unclaimed and unthreatening, inviting presence rather than endurance. The absence of watchful eyes unsettled her at first, exposing how deeply vigilance had shaped her sense of safety. She had learned to exist in reaction. Now she was faced with stillness that required no defense. In this quieter rhythm, intimacy emerged without urgency or performance. There were no declarations to be made, no conflicts demanding resolution, only the steady unfolding of ordinary moments shaped by choice rather than consequence. Seraphina discovered herself speaking more freely, not because fear had vanished, but because it no longer dictated silence. She did not need to justify her presence or brace for withdrawal. The realization altered her posture toward the world, allowing her to inhabit each moment without calculating its end. Alaric moved through this retreat with equal attentiveness, mindful not to impose structure where gentleness was required. He understood that healing did not arrive through reassurance alone, but through consistency unburdened by demand. He did not attempt to define their future during these days, nor did he seek to anchor the quiet with promise. Instead, he allowed time to serve its purpose, trusting that what had endured opposition did not require reinforcement through urgency. His restraint, once sharpened by discipline, softened into something more expansive, shaped by mutual regard rather than control. For Seraphina, the intimacy of this period lay not in closeness alone, but in the absence of fear that once accompanied it. She had expected vulnerability to feel like exposure. Instead, it felt like rest. The constant readiness to retreat loosened its grip, replaced by an unfamiliar steadiness that did not depend on vigilance. She recognized how much of her strength had been consumed by survival, how little space had been left for gentler forms of courage. Here, she practiced remaining without armor, learning that safety could exist without isolation. They spoke of ordinary things, of plans unbound by urgency, of responsibilities that would eventually call them back into visibility. Yet these conversations carried a different weight now, grounded not in fear of loss but in trust shaped by experience. They did not pretend the world beyond the retreat would be easier. They acknowledged its complexities without allowing them to eclipse the peace they were cultivating. The balance felt deliberate, chosen rather than imposed. By the end of the retreat, Seraphina understood that healing had not erased the past, nor had it diminished the cost of what they had chosen. What it had done was restore her relationship to herself. She no longer measured her worth by endurance alone. She recognized that strength could exist alongside softness without contradiction. As they prepared to return, she felt no dread, only readiness. The quiet they had shared was not something to be left behind. It had become part of her, steady and unclaimed, proof that peace, once chosen, did not require hiding to survive. When they returned from the retreat, they did not rush to declare what they had become. Both understood that definition, when imposed too quickly, could harden into expectation rather than agreement. Instead, they spoke with deliberate care about what lay ahead, not as fantasy or reassurance, but as structure shaped by mutual consent. Seraphina found herself approaching these conversations with a steadiness she would not have recognized in herself months earlier. She no longer feared that clarity would invite loss. Clarity, she was learning, was not demand but foundation. They discussed responsibility openly, acknowledging that their lives could not simply narrow around one another without consequence. Alaric did not assume leadership in these exchanges, nor did he defer in a way that diminished his own position. He listened, weighed, and responded as partner rather than authority. The balance mattered deeply to Seraphina. For so long her choices had been reactive, shaped by what others required of her absence. Now she was shaping presence, defining what she would offer and what she would not surrender. The distinction felt profound. She spoke of boundaries without apology, naming the parts of herself she would no longer erase for the sake of harmony. Alaric received this without resistance, recognizing that partnership demanded not absorption but alignment. He articulated his own commitments with equal clarity, acknowledging where compromise was possible and where it would become self-betrayal. There was no illusion that agreement would always come easily. What they established instead was process, a shared understanding that difference would be addressed through honesty rather than silence. For Seraphina, this negotiation marked a transformation more significant than public vindication. She was no longer being chosen despite herself, nor was she choosing love at the expense of identity. She was participating fully, her voice carrying equal weight in shaping what followed. The fear that once accompanied attachment had not vanished, but it no longer governed her decisions. She felt grounded in something steadier than hope, a trust built not on promise but on demonstrated regard. Alaric, too, felt the shift within himself. Leadership, he realized, did not diminish when shared. Authority refined itself through accountability, through the willingness to be known rather than obeyed. Loving Seraphina required him to relinquish habits shaped by solitary decision-making, replacing them with collaboration that demanded patience and vulnerability. The change did not weaken him, it clarified him. They did not mark this moment with ceremony. There was no declaration of future sealed by spectacle. What passed between them was quieter and more enduring, an agreement practiced rather than proclaimed. They moved forward with the understanding that love, to remain whole, required maintenance rather than protection, presence rather than control. By the end of the segment, Seraphina felt a settled confidence take root. She was no longer navigating her life around fear of erasure. She was building alongside someone who met her not as problem or exception, but as equal. The future remained uncertain, shaped by forces beyond their control, yet the foundation beneath her feet felt solid. Whatever they faced next would be met not through endurance alone, but through partnership deliberately and courageously chosen. The world did not transform overnight, nor did acceptance arrive with warmth or apology. Instead, it unfolded gradually, reshaping itself around what could no longer be ignored. Seraphina observed the recalibration with detached awareness, recognizing how swiftly certainty gave way to accommodation once permanence asserted itself. What had once provoked alarm now invited fatigue, and what could not be undone lost its urgency. She did not seek this shift, nor did she derive satisfaction from it. Belonging, she had learned, was rarely offered freely. It was conceded. Some who had once avoided her softened their distance, their curiosity now framed as civility rather than suspicion. Others retreated into silence, unwilling to confront their own complicity in the narrative that had shaped her isolation. A few attempted quiet reconciliation, gestures offered without acknowledgement of past harm. Seraphina met each response with the same measured composure, no longer interpreting them as verdicts on her worth. Acceptance, she understood, was not the same as justice. It was simply adjustment. Alaric navigated these shifts with steady clarity, neither exploiting renewed openness nor resisting it. He understood that power adapted when confronted with consistency, that what endured without apology eventually redefined the boundaries of influence. He did not seek to restore what had been lost, nor did he lament it. What remained was more precise, less burdened by unspoken compromise. The recalibration refined his authority, narrowing it into something more deliberate and less performative. For Seraphina, the most significant change occurred internally. The absence of constant opposition left her with space she had never known how to inhabit. She found herself no longer scanning for threat or anticipating withdrawal, no longer measuring her presence by tolerance. The world's gradual acceptance mattered less than her own. She was learning to exist without preparing for disappearance, a practice that required patience and self-trust. There were moments when old habits resurfaced, when she instinctively read silence as judgment or distance as warning. Yet those moments no longer carried the weight they once had. She recognized them for what they were, remnants of survival rather than reflections of reality. With time, even those instincts began to soften. Together, she and Alaric moved through this period without urgency, allowing the world to adjust at its own pace. They did not frame acceptance as victory, nor did they demand recognition. What mattered was the life they were shaping, one grounded in choice rather than reaction. The stability they cultivated did not depend on approval. It depended on consistency. By the end of the segment, Seraphina understood that belonging had taken on a new meaning. It was no longer something granted by others, nor something she sought to earn through endurance. It was something she carried within herself, reinforced by partnership and self-possession. The world might continue to shift, but its movement no longer dictated her place within it. She stood anchored, not by acceptance, but by the certainty of who she was and who she chose to be. Reflection came to Seraphina in quiet intervals rather than dramatic moments, settling gently into her awareness as she moved through days no longer governed by vigilance. She found herself thinking less about what had been taken from her, and more about what had shaped her, recognizing that survival, while necessary, had never been the whole of her strength. The years of isolation had taught her discipline, observation, and restraint, yet they had also taught her to withhold parts of herself she no longer wished to keep hidden. The woman she had become was not erased by what she had endured, but neither was she confined by it. She allowed herself, at last, to grieve without self-reproach, grief for the lost ease of youth, for friendships never formed, for moments lived behind careful reserve. This mourning did not weaken her. It clarified her compassion, deepening her understanding of herself and others. She saw now that endurance had been a beginning, not an end, a means of preservation rather than fulfillment. What followed survival was choice, and choice required a different kind of courage. In these reflections, Seraphina recognized how thoroughly fear had once shaped her decisions, convincing her that safety lay in invisibility. Letting go of that belief did not erase fear entirely, but it loosened its authority. She no longer equated quiet with security or distance with dignity. Instead, she practiced presence, learning to inhabit spaces without apology or anticipation of retreat. The practice felt unfamiliar at times, even uncomfortable, yet it grounded her in a reality she could now claim as her own. Her partnership with Alaric served not as anchor, but as mirror, reflecting the strength she was still discovering. He did not define her transformation, nor did he guide it. He witnessed it, offering steadiness without direction. This distinction mattered deeply. For the first time, Seraphina experienced intimacy without surrender, connection without erasure. She understood that love did not replace identity. It revealed it. There were moments when she caught herself responding with old caution, measuring words, scanning expressions for threat that no longer existed. Each time, she chose differently, reminding herself that vigilance was habit, not necessity. The world had not become harmless, but she had become less governed by its judgments. That shift felt more powerful than any public vindication. By the close of the segment, Seraphina stood reconciled with the woman she had been and the woman she was becoming. The past no longer demanded explanation or defense. It informed her without defining her. She carried it with understanding rather than weight. What lay ahead remained unwritten, yet she approached it without the reflex to disappear. She had survived exile. Now she was learning how to live beyond it, not as an exception, but as herself, complete and unashamed. For Alaric, change arrived not as upheaval but as recognition, a gradual awareness that loving Seraphina had altered the framework through which he understood power, responsibility, and himself. He had long believed that authority required distance, that clarity of judgment was best preserved through restraint and separation. Those principles had served him well, shaping a reputation built on consistency and control. Yet in choosing Seraphina openly, he had discovered that restraint did not lose its value when paired with vulnerability. It gained dimension. He reflected often on how easily leadership could become insulated, protected by habit, and reinforced by silence. The alliances he had once navigated without question now appeared differently to him, not as necessities but as choices shaped by comfort rather than conviction. Loving Seraphina had stripped away the illusion that integrity could be preserved through neutrality alone. He understood now that power, when left unexamined, defaulted toward convenience. To lead with integrity required presence, not detachment, and the willingness to be seen making difficult choices without retreat. This realization did not diminish his sense of duty. It refined it. Alaric found himself listening more closely, not only to advisors but to those whose voices had once been softened by hierarchy. He questioned assumptions he had previously accepted as structural realities, recognizing how easily systems protected themselves at the expense of individuals. The shift was subtle, yet profound. Authority no longer felt like something to defend, but something to steward with accountability. His relationship with Seraphina was central to this transformation, not because she demanded change, but because she embodied its necessity. She had survived the consequences of unexamined power too thoroughly for him to ignore its cost. Loving her meant accepting that leadership carried moral obligation beyond maintenance of order. It demanded courage equal to restraint. He understood now that emotional reserve, when unchallenged, could become another form of avoidance. To remain emotionally present with her required honesty that did not weaken him. It strengthened him. There were moments when the weight of consequence pressed heavily, when the loss of former ease tempted him toward nostalgia. Yet even then, he did not regret what had been forfeited. The clarity he had gained outweighed the comfort he had surrendered. He no longer measured success by stability alone, but by coherence between belief and action. This alignment brought a steadiness he had not known before, one not dependent on approval or legacy. In quieter moments, Alaric observed Seraphina's continued growth with admiration untainted by possessiveness. He did not see her strength as something he had enabled, but something he had learned to recognize and honor. The distinction mattered. Loving her had not reshaped her into something new. It had reshaped him. By the end of the segment, Alaric stood grounded in a redefined understanding of himself. Leadership, he realized, was not compromised by love. It was clarified by it. The man he had been had relied on control to navigate consequence. The man he was becoming relied on integrity and presence. Whatever challenges awaited them, he knew he would meet them not from behind distance, but from within commitment, no longer ruling from restraint alone, but leading from truth openly chosen. What secured their future was not ceremony alone, nor the outward markers that society relied upon to validate permanence. Those considerations, while not dismissed, no longer carried the weight they once might have. Seraphina understood now that declarations could be withdrawn and rituals performed without conviction. What endured was practice, the daily choice to remain present when ease was absent and expectation pressed in. Commitment, she had learned, revealed itself not in spectacle, but in continuity. Together, she and Alaric established rhythms shaped by intention rather than obligation. They did not rush to replicate models handed down by tradition without examination. Instead, they questioned what permanence required of them individually and collectively, negotiating their future with the same clarity that had guided them through conflict. This process felt neither romantic nor transactional. It felt honest. Seraphina no longer feared that such discussions would invite erasure. Her voice held equal weight, her needs articulated without apology. The act of shaping a shared life no longer required sacrifice of self. It required alignment. There were moments when uncertainty surfaced, when the absence of rigid definition felt unsettling. Yet Seraphina recognized this discomfort as freedom rather than instability. For the first time, the future was not dictated by avoidance or reaction. It was something they were actively building, piece by piece, through mutual regard and sustained choice. The steadiness this brought surprised her. She no longer measured security by the absence of threat, but by the presence of trust, practiced consistently. Alaric approached this stage of their life with the same deliberateness that had marked his leadership, yet the impulse to control no longer guided him. He understood that permanence could not be enforced without becoming fragile. What endured did so because it was chosen repeatedly, not protected through dominance or concession. Loving Seraphina required attentiveness rather than authority, responsiveness rather than command. This awareness did not diminish him, it refined him further. As they moved forward, society observed without urgency, its curiosity tempered by the realization that what had once been controversial was now settled. Resistance had exhausted itself against their consistency. Acceptance, when it arrived, felt secondary. What mattered was that the life they were shaping did not rely on permission. It rested on commitment expressed through action rather than declaration. In quieter moments, Seraphina reflected on how far she had come from the woman who once believed endurance was the highest form of dignity. She had not abandoned strength. She had expanded it. Strength now included softness, presence, and the courage to be known. Loving Alaric had not replaced her identity. It had allowed it to stand without armor. By the end of the segment, the future felt neither idealized nor uncertain. It felt lived in already, shaped by habits of trust and respect that promised continuity beyond circumstance. Whatever formal acknowledgement lay ahead would serve not as proof, but as affirmation of something already established. Their bond no longer required defense or justification. It existed as fact, sustained by daily choice, and grounded in a love that had earned its permanence through patience, truth, and shared purpose. Peace did not arrive as stillness untouched by memory, nor did it erase the paths that had led Seraphina and Alaric to this place. It arrived instead as something earned, layered carefully over truth, consequence, and choice, steady rather than fragile. The past did not vanish. It settled. What once loomed as warning no longer dictated direction. Seraphina felt this most clearly in moments of quiet, when she realized she was no longer bracing herself against the world, no longer measuring her presence by how easily it might be withdrawn. She stood where she stood because she chose to, not because endurance demanded it. There were days when echoes of old fear surfaced without invitation, when memory whispered that safety was temporary and attention fickle, yet those echoes no longer governed her actions. She recognized them as remnants, not prophecies, habits of survival that no longer served her. Each time she chose presence over retreat, those habits loosened their hold. The strength she carried now was not forged solely through suffering. It was sustained through self-trust, a trust she had built deliberately and refused to surrender again. Alaric watched this evolution with a quiet reverence that did not seek credit. He understood that love did not complete Seraphina. It met her where she already stood. His role had never been to save her from the world, but to refuse participation in her erasure. That refusal had reshaped them both. He no longer viewed leadership as distance maintained, but as integrity practiced openly. Loving her had demanded that alignment, and he had accepted it without reservation. Their life together unfolded, without need for justification. Some observed from a distance, others recalibrated their understanding of what had once been deemed dangerous. What could not be undone was eventually accepted, not through apology but through permanence. Seraphina no longer waited for acceptance to feel secure. Belonging had become internal, reinforced by partnership rather than granted by permission. She had learned that dignity did not require isolation, only truth upheld consistently. In moments shared between them, there was no urgency to define what had already proven itself. Love existed not as declaration, but as pattern, in the way they listened, in the way they chose each other without spectacle, in the way disagreement did not threaten presence. Their bond was not free of difficulty, but it was free of fear. That distinction mattered more than any promise. Seraphina sometimes reflected on the woman she had been, the one no suitor dared approach, the figure shaped by warning and silence. She did not resent that past self. She honored her. That woman had endured when endurance was the only option, yet she also recognized how far she had come, how much courage it had taken to step beyond survival into visibility. Loving Alaric had not made her fearless. It had made her willing. Standing now within a life no longer governed by rumor or restraint, Seraphina felt a quiet certainty settle into place. What had once been forbidden was now simply lived. What had once been feared had been faced. The world had not softened entirely, but she had changed how she met it. She no longer disappeared to preserve peace. She embodied it. And so the story closed not with triumph, but with steadiness, with a woman who claimed her life fully and a man who stood beside her without needing to lead or retreat. Love endured not because it defied warning, but because it refused to surrender to it. What remained was not legend or scandal, but a shared future shaped by courage, truth, and the simple, powerful act of choosing one another every day.